Everybody ready to snap out of their lunch coma? Last session of the day. You guys enjoyed the WordCamp? All right, our final workshop speaker used the power of flight to join us from Denver, Colorado, where he spends his days fighting bugs, spends his nights screening data that's held hostage by publishing applications. He's the fearless leader at WPGraphQL plugin, which gives regular old civilians superpowers to work with WordPress data in magical new ways. He's normally bringing justice to large publishing sites like the Orange County Register, but today he's here to teach us how to create superpowered single-page apps. Please join me in welcoming Jason Bell.
Cool. Thank you. Cool. All right. So let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough into the mic, if I need to speak up or anything. So this is a workshop, so if you have your laptop with you, you can follow along and be hands-on with some parts of it. If not, you can just watch, and I think it'll be pretty valuable just watching too. So I have a lot of code sandbox snippets embedded in the slides, so there's not going to be any local environment set up. So if you just go to these slides on your desktop, pull that up, any of the hands-on code that we do will be in these slides. So I'll give you guys a second to do that. It's slides.com. I'll zoom in a little bit if you can't see. I would recommend maybe scooting up a little bit because I'll zoom in when I can, but small screen, so scooting up as far as you can will probably be beneficial to all of us. Yeah, if you go to slides.com/JasonBall1, JASONBAHL-1/WCOC, that's these slides. And then the next thing that would be helpful would be a tool called GraphQL. If you have these slides pulled up, these are both links. So there's a desktop app you can download on Mac. If you're on Windows, there's a Chrome extension. If you don't have Chrome or Mac, just watch, because I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, the Chrome extension should work, I believe, Mac or PC. So we'll use that later on. And then if you haven't worked with React or Redux, you probably don't have DevTools installed on Chrome. And Apollo is another DevTools we'll be looking at one point. So those are totally optional, but really helpful if you want to do single-page application development with React specifically. So get those downloaded if you can. I'll give everybody a minute to get these slides pulled up and work through that if they want. Cool. Anybody need more time with that? All right. So yeah, so like you said, I'm here to talk about building superpowered single-page apps with React, WordPress, and what didn't get mentioned in the title is GraphQL. So once again, my name is Jason Ball, at Jason Ball on Twitter. I don't tweet that much, and it's only WordPress related when I do. So if you do want to follow me, you won't get spammed. I will link to, I'm actually recording this on my screen as well, so I'll link to the recording if you want to follow up. I'll link to basically anything I'm mentioning here. So about me, I'm a senior WordPress engineer at Digital First Media in Denver, Colorado. Born and raised in Denver, still there, one of the few. Everybody else I know is from California, so thanks for that, guys. Traffic is starting to look like California's out there, so no. I've been working with WordPress for over 8 years, full-time. Been working with WordPress for about 9 years, full-time with WordPress for about 8 years. Love WordPress, open source projects in general. And part of the reason I'm here, I'm the creator and maintainer of the WPGraphQL plugin, which is on GitHub, open source. You can go download it today, activate it on your WordPress install, and you'll have GraphQL endpoint, which we'll talk about what that means later. So things we'll cover in this workshop. I'm going to introduce you to React and GraphQL with WordPress. So we're actually going to get hands-on and build a single-page app. We're going to look at composing components, styling components. We're going to introduce routing in React app. We're going to look at using Redux for state management in a single page app. And then we're going to look at using GraphQL queries to populate data into our app. And then we're actually going to touch WordPress to customize the GraphQL schema and what data we can get out of WordPress. So yeah, why build single page apps, especially with WordPress? In 2015 at the State of the Word, Matt Mullenweg basically commanded us to learn JavaScript deeply. That's where the web is headed. Single page apps with JavaScript is just where things are going with the web if they're not there already. So if we look around us, the interfaces we have, just stuff we interact with on a daily basis, we have things like Netflix or Calypso, WordPress.com, Slack, Facebook. These are all examples, for the most part, of single page apps. Apps that load an interface and then just send data back and forth to a server. When you make interactions, they don't reload entire pages. They just reload. They just send data back and forth, and on occasion we'll reload new templates. But for the most part, templates are given to you once, and then just data is passed back and forth from the server to your browser. So this is what it looks like. A classic, way back in the day, early 2017 and before. This is how applications used to be built, right? So we'd have a database, then we'd have a server. A server would get all the data it needed to from the database, run some business logic on the server, grab all the HTML it needed, everything it needed to get to your web, send it up to your DOM or your client, your browser, or your native, or your iOS device or whatever, your Android. Send it up there. When you made an interaction, submitted a form, for example, or navigated to a different page, the entire cycle happens again. The server looks for stuff in the database, potentially looks for caches if they exist or whatnot, but then the server is responsible for compiling everything and sending everything back to you. Now things have begun to transition. Your first request, that will happen. The database will get the data. It'll send stuff to a server. The server will figure out like who you are, for example, what you're allowed to see, what you're not allowed to see. Send that up to the client. And then further on, your DOM has already loaded the JavaScript elements, the templates. It will only send data back and forth from the client to the server, making it a lot faster for you to interact with sites. So that's kind of where we're headed with web development. Here's some examples of single page app components in action. So we have like Twitter. When I post a tweet, I'm submitting a form, and my entire page isn't reloading. It's submitting my tweet to Twitter, and then you see it re-render. After I submit, it will re-render, giving me feedback that something happened. There you go, now I have a new tweet. Okay, cool, I can keep interacting with Twitter, right? I don't have to go through this whole process of reloading the entire Twitter site like I would perhaps saving a post in WordPress, for example. Same thing with Slack. These are just examples of stateful interactions on single-page apps. So Slack, when I refresh, only parts of the UI are refreshing when I interact with it. So when I change channels, you see just the pane on the right will refresh, and then reload data that's needed. Same thing with Facebook. I can change the state of the component, and just certain things in the UI are changing, not the entire app. So there's just examples of like JavaScript in the modern web, building UIs that just send data to a server and then let you continue doing what you're doing in the interface. So there's obviously a lot of ways you can approach using JavaScript to build apps. My preference personally is React, but there's obviously a lot of options out there like Angular and Vue, which Jacob actually did a great talk about yesterday, or just plain old vanilla JavaScript. For this, we're going to look at using React though. React, if you're not familiar with it, is an open source JavaScript library created and maintained by Facebook, which, depending how you look at it, may be a pro or maybe a con. I don't know, but I think it's a good thing. It's a declarative component-based architecture. It uses what's called JSX, which is a JavaScript XML-ish hybrid language that then compiles down to JavaScript. And then it uses two things called props and state to manage state of your application, which we'll look at later. And that allows you to manage your data outside of the DOM, so you're not constantly adding like data dash attributes to your HTML markup and whatnot. So to understand how React works, let's take a look at the DOM. This is kind of fuzzy. Apologize, it's really low quality image, so I'll walk you through it. This is just the document object model. So this is what the browser uses to render things to us. So at the top, of course, we have a document. This should look familiar if you've done any web development like WordPress themes or anything. So we have a document. Inside that, we have an HTML tag. Then we have a head tag, which can have things like title or meta or CSS links or whatnot. Then we have a body tag, and that's kind of where your app or your WordPress theme or your website or whatever it might be lives. And all of these things are objects that get sent to the DOM, and the DOM renders it. So when you understand that, what React does is creates a virtual DOM, which doesn't actually render to the actual browser DOM. But as things change, it uses this virtual DOM to compare the real DOM with the virtual DOM, figures out the minimal changes that need to be made to re-render your application when things change. So at the bottom of this example, we have the real DOM. So something happens, React takes it up to the virtual DOM, figures out what changed, figures out what components under that are affected by the change. Once it's computed and figured out what the difference is, then it can apply those changes to the browser DOM. So behind the scenes, React's doing its thing, figure out what needs to change. The actual DOM isn't affected yet until React has figured out what needs to change. This all happens in milliseconds, so in most cases. So you'll never notice as a user. But it makes it very efficient. Instead of re-rendering the entire page, it can re-render just the minimal things that need to change as things in your application change. So that's a super quick intro to React. I think instead of telling you a bunch of theory about React, I think the best way to get into this is by actually building something. So this is a screenshot of what we're actually going to hopefully build today. So the finished product is at this URL, learn.wpgraphql.com. I also do have, and I'll tweet out a link and whatnot to this, but if you go to WPGraphQL.com, I actually do have this written out as a tutorial series as well, so you can follow along on your own time. If you go to WPGraphQL.com and then click Learn, I got a 12-step tutorial written down here that goes through everything we're building today. And within that, there's also links to the GitHub repo. Oh, let's see. Yep. So there's also a GitHub repo, and I created this step by step from basically no code all the way to a finished product. Every commit in there has basically a paragraph explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So if I do move too fast, you can go check out this repo. I'll tweet out a link to that too, so you guys can follow along at home on your own time, because I probably will go too fast for somebody at some point. So, but yeah, you can go into any of these commits, and so there's 41 total commits in this. Oops, clicked on the wrong thing. But if you go to any of these commits, yeah, like I said, I got like a paragraph or something of comments in there. Oh, that was not a good example. Yeah, so like in my commits, I write a lot of stuff for something like 30 lines of code changing. I write almost as much English text explaining why. So trying to make this helpful for you beyond today. So yeah, we can look at learn.wpgraphql.com. I built it as a WordPress theme, so at the end of the day, in that tutorial series, we won't actually look at that today, but I actually take our single-page JavaScript app and hook it into WordPress, so it's actually a WordPress theme. We're not actually going to do that today, though, but if you follow that written workshop, you'll be able to do that in that. So what this is, it's basically 3 pages. So we've got a home page, WordFlix. It's a superhero movie browsing app, so we can click explore films. I didn't style accounting for the WordPress admin bar, so sorry about that. My navigation's being overlapped by that. But we have 2 links up here. One says home, one says browse movies. If I click browse movies, we come to this page. If I click home, I go back to that page. If I click browse movies again, I can click into an individual movie, see details about that movie, go back to browse more movies, scroll down, click load more, see more movies. All these movies, for what it's worth, I just crawled an open source movie database called the Movie Database. Brought a bunch of stuff into WordPress, so everything's getting served from WordPress. There is actually a local by Flywheel instance in the written tutorial, so you can actually download and have the same WordPress install that I have, which would have all these superhero movies and images and all that jazz for you too. And just so you can see, everything is in here as posts. So we're just using WordPress posts for this. All right, so if you have the slides pulled up, you can come to this slide. I have codesandbox embedded here. So this one, if you have the slides pulled up, you can go to the slide that's titled Intro to Components and Styled Components. So this is going to get us started just with very, very basic React. So we've got 17 lines of code, and 7 of them are commented out or blank lines. So we've got very minimal code. I will open this and zoom in further. But again, the best zoom is your feet. if you want to scoot up. I'll do my best to zoom in for the folks in back, but seriously, you might want to move up. So to create your very first React component, this highlighted portion of code here creates a React component. So we've got 6 lines of code to create a React component, and then we have 1 line of code that renders that component to the DOM. So I can change this here. You guys can actually change this yourselves too. It'll create a fork for yourself on CodeSandbox, and then you can change it and mess with it later if you want to. But you can see I can change stuff in here in my code, and it's going to render off there. So to create a React component, you import React. I'm also using ES6 as a disclaimer. So, and then this compiles down to plain JavaScript. ES6 is the next generation of JavaScript, which Zach may be able to answer this better than I can, but will actually be part of the JavaScript spec very soon. Do you know? I don't know dates, but ES6. Cool. So very soon, everything I'm doing here, you'll be able to do in browser. What's that? Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's just a disclaimer though. This is using ES6, so in some cases you might need a tool that bundles it down. But yeah, so a React component, to actually render it, it needs 1 method. So here we create a component. We say class app extends component. So now we have an app component. We add a render method, which renders something. And to have that render something, we need to return what it should render. In our case, we're doing an h1 tag. If you have this pulled up, you'll see the steps on how to get to the next step are commented and explain what to do next. So first thing we're going to look at is composing components. So we have an app component. We can put another component inside of that, which gives us the power eventually to build stuff like layouts, right? So it's very similar to like template parts in WordPress. So the first step here, it says uncomment the next line. So we'll go ahead and uncomment that. This imports our homepage component from another file, which in codesandbox you can see our files over here. We have a components directory and a homepage file, and we'll look at that in a second. So we uncomment that. So now we've imported the homepage. Now we can do something with the homepage. We see number 2 here asks us to replace the contents of the app component with the following. So we can just copy, or I'll just type. We can replace the contents of this homepage. And you'll see right away if I'm typing something wrong, I'm getting errors, so I know I'm doing something wrong. But if I do it right, which I did, yep, thanks. There we go. Cool. So now the app component is rendering another component, and it's got some styles. So let's go check out how I got that. So we can go here to components, homepage. That's the one we just imported and rendered into our app. So this is in each of these steps I do a little bit of legwork, so you don't have to do everything, and I'll explain it, and then we'll build on that in the next step. So in this case, at the very top, you'll notice a pattern. Any of these files import at the top are dependencies. So any libraries we might be using, Any other parts of code or components that we've written that we want to reuse, we import at the top, and then we declare things that we're going to be using, and then we actually build our component that renders. So what we're doing here, we're importing React, of course, because we're still using React. I think this one actually, this second import was a mistake. We don't actually need that. And then we import a library called styled, which is a library for React that allows you to build components and apply styles to them directly in React. So you get the full power of CSS plus some. You actually get full CSS syntax. There are some, if you are familiar with React and styling in JavaScript, there's various solutions out there for styling in JavaScript. Many of them don't use actual CSS. They do their own tricks to compile down into CSS. But in this case, styled components allows us to do anything you can do with CSS. So in our case, I can change color. Let's say I want the background to be green. I can just start typing here and now I have a green background. I could play with like the height. For me, I'm using 100% of the viewport height, but if I didn't have that, it would be whatever. It's just regular CSS. There's no compile step to this either. Styled components is just amazing. So what's cool about styled components that you can't do, I don't believe in every browser yet, is nested CSS though. So I could say, yeah, you could do nested stuff like, let's say, any H1. Let's say we wanted, like, what do we want to do? Maybe a hover attribute. Oops. So I can say any H1 within the wrapper, when I hover over it, make the color red. So very cool. Right here, I'm in one file. I've written styles in my file. I've written my markup that's going to get output. So it's very powerful stuff. And then I can nest these components. So I have a wrapper. I created this wrapper that has these style attributes. Then I create a page title component, which is just an H1. And then I use those components in my home page component, and I compose those. So I have a wrapper. Inside that, I have a page title that says my first React component. The wrapper and the page title now use those CSS styles I applied in my styled components. So now we have this home page rendering. We have it organized in different files. We have our app entry point. Now we have a home page file. And now we have composed components. So we can start building powerful layouts. We can style it. All the logic is in one spot. I have the part that renders to the DOM here. I also have the styles here. As a developer long term, I don't have to figure out where my styles are in some CSS library that potentially somebody 6 years ago wrote. There's actually a blog post, medium.com. A developer there wrote a blog post about on medium.com. There's a bell icon like for alerts in the top right of the page. And I think if you go hover over that in CSS and inspect in your DOM in the Chrome DevTools, I think there's like 600 things that get applied to that in CSS, because over time CSS becomes very difficult to manage. And it's very hard to sometimes maintain what CSS applies to what. So this eliminates that need. If we inspect the DOM too, what's also very unique about this is everything gets unique prefix. So if we inspect the DOM, so let me zoom in on DevTools here. If we inspect the DOM though, this class has a unique namespace now. Styled Components did some legwork and created a unique namespace. So here it's class FARSZA, right? So now the only thing that is going to get these styles is this component. So I can create other H1s throughout my application with different styles, or I can reuse this H1 and they'll all get those styles, right? So, but it's never going to conflict with anything else in my application, which is pretty amazing. Where like libraries like Bootstrap, for example, will have a generic class like BTN and then a class like primary or secondary, but that could also be applied. You might have primary on buttons and on your nav and maybe on something else. So primary could potentially affect three things. and you might be at the point where I want to change primary buttons to be a different color. So you might quickly go to change primary from blue to green, but then you realize all of a sudden some nav bars change to green too. So it can get really tricky to manage CSS over time. So this is an option if you are doing single page application development. So very, very quick, that's a quick intro into styled components. Does anybody have any questions yet? Pretty basic stuff. So we can... Yeah, exactly. So, yep. Yeah, so this codesandbox is, I believe, using Webpack behind the scenes, so you can install any of these packages through NPM. So here in codesandbox, you can see the dependencies. I've set up all of the steps have the same dependencies for this tutorial. I have like 6 steps, I think, linked through these slides. So like we're not using a lot of these dependencies yet, but we will. So yeah, if you were building this, the written tutorial I have actually walks you through like building it locally and installing NPM dependencies and whatnot. I was just trying to make it so nobody had any local environment set up for this. So let's go to the next one. Cool. So that's our first component. So with any application, usually routes or routing, adding different pages is obviously a pretty common thing. So let's take a look at how to do this. So disclaimer, I am using an older version of React Router. So if you do look at using React Router, I think the API has changed a little bit. So some things I'll be showing here, you might have to tweak a little bit to use a more recent version of React Router. There is also different routers you can use with React. This I just think is probably the most popular one, and I think it works pretty well. So this step, I jumped ahead a little bit. I made a couple additional styled components. So now we have a title. I'll zoom out a little bit. So now we have a title, we have our description, we have a button that does nothing yet. So I went ahead and built those styled components in our home page. And now we're going to look at introducing routing. Row-at. So again, this step I've got comments trying to list out what to do. So in this case, we're going to uncomment these imports below. So this does nothing yet, but I'm importing things we're about to use. So at the top, I import some functions from React Router. Then next, I import use scroll from React Router scroll. What that does is React Router is going to allow us to change pages, right? So we can go to /page1/page2, and then it'll render a component that we tell it to. Use scroll will allow us to use the back button in a browser, and it'll remember the position you were at on that page. So if you scrolled halfway down, the home page, clicked the button, went to page 2, said, oh, that's not what I was looking for, click back, it would take you back to halfway down the home page, which is just a handy thing. Next thing we do is import sync history with store from React Router Redux, and then we import a couple of functions from a state file. And these will set up a Redux store. We'll go over to the state file in a minute and look at what that means. I'll actually show you what Redux is in a minute as well. Then step 2 in this one, uncomment these lines. So these 2 lines, it configures our Redux store, and then it syncs our React Router history with our Redux store. This will all kind of make sense in a minute. And then next, I've modified, or I've created 2 new components. So it asks us to uncomment these components here. So we're creating 2 components. First one is movies page. This is going to be our page that displays the grid of movies. So at this point, it's very simple. It returns a div, and inside that div, we have an H1. We have a link to the home page, and then we have a link to a movie page just with a placeholder movie/movie ID. So very, very simple. We'll see what that looks like in a second. And then I create a movie page. This will be our movie detail page. And same thing, very simple. It just returns a div with a H1 title movie page, a link back to the home, and a link back to the movies page. So super simple components right now. And then this fourth step, it just asks us to replace the contents of the app with the following. So I'll uncomment that, cut that, and we'll replace, instead of home page, we'll replace that here. Let me format that. Alright. So what we have here, so again, there's about 5 lines of code here for our, so this is what actually is going to get rendered. Our app is what renders to the DOM, if you remember. Here we render the app to the DOM. Now the app is going to return a router. This router is just another component. It stores the history, and then it uses the middleware use scroll, which let me toggle there. So during the render method, it applies what's called middleware to use scroll so that it can remember that position on the back button. And then we add a couple routes. So first route we add is a movies page. So we just say, hey browser, anytime you get to url.com/movies, I want you to render this component. In our case, that component is movies page component, which we just defined up here, which will be an H1, a link to the home page, and a link to a movie detail page. And then we add another route. We say movies/:movie ID. So what this is going to say is basically any value that comes after this, if it's movie/something, try to render the movie page. And then we have a wildcard route at the bottom that is going to basically take any route we give it, and it's going to render whatever component we say. In a normal application, this would probably be a 404 page. You would do a wildcard and say, render like error not found if somebody entered a route that can't be found. In our case, we're just going to default to the home page for simplicity. So if we go save this, look here. Now if I click this Explore Films, this is a link that should take us to /movies. There we go, we have a page. It has no styles, it just has the movies page component, which is an H1 with our 2 links. I can look at this in split view again so you can see. We have movies page that outputs an H1, a link to home, a link to movie. So we have a link to home, link to movie. So I can click to movie detail page. We'll see my URL changes. Oops. My URL changes to movie/movie ID, and my movie page component is rendering. So very quickly, we've composed components now. We have a single page app that actually has multiple pages, and haven't really done a whole lot of complex stuff ourselves yet. So that's a very quick intro to routing with React. Does anybody have any questions on that? That makes sense. All right. So let's really quick, one thing I did do is import some things from the state file. So the state file, without my comments, is only about 15 or 20 lines of code. So here we're setting up what's called a Redux store. Is anybody familiar with Redux? Cool. I will show you the Redux DevTools in a minute, and I think it will all make sense, and you will never want to touch anything on the web without it. Maybe. I don't know. I think it's pretty awesome. So what Redux is a state manager. So it's a client-side state manager. What that means is that it can become the source of truth for everything on your client. So your application will send data to it. It's an object that lives in the client. You can send data to it. The object will clone itself with your new changes to it. You can listen to those changes, and in React's case, you can have a component subscribe to it or parts of it, and that component will change when anything in that state tree changes. When I open up the DevTools, it'll all make sense, I hope. So very quickly, we just import a couple dependencies. We create what's called a root reducer, which just tells Redux what the shape of our state tree should look like. In our case, we add an entry point called routing, and we pass in a helper from React Router called the router reducer. This will have, anytime we change routes, React Router is going to send changed data to Redux, and then anywhere in our application, we can subscribe to that data and make decisions based on it. Then another thing I do is set up a logger middleware. This is just for DevTools. In a second, you'll see when I inspect in Chrome, actions that are passing through Redux will be console logged out with a lot of helpful data. And then this last part, again, I do what's called configure the store. So I pass through the reducer that we created with the routing state tree entry point. And then I pass through what's called initial state. So I say at the beginning, when our app first loads, our state should just be an empty object. So when you first load the app, there's no state that Redux is aware of. And then I apply the middleware, which gives us support to use Redux DevTools. So let me actually open this with Redux DevTools now. I'll just open it up in the learn.wpGraphQL. So if you do have Redux DevTools installed in Chrome, you can open up your inspector. You'll have Redux here. So if I refresh the page, let's see. So as I click things, you'll see Redux is aware of what's changing because the React router is aware of or is sending data to the Redux tree. So I can click on things, and as I click, you'll see location change, location change, location change. So this is everything in the app is sending data, or the router in our app is sending data to Redux. Redux is an object that gets cloned with the changed data. So using Redux gives us power to do things like time travel. So I can zoom in on these tools? Let's see. Alright, so it gives us power. So it's listening to what's changing in our application, and since it's doing that, we can actually step through time and see what actions led to what outcome. So this is super powerful from a developer perspective. It makes things predictable. It also, since everything in Redux is an object or an array or whatever you tell it to be, essentially, you can actually hook things up to save it somewhere like maybe a database, right? So we have, where I work, we occasionally get some bugs where a client is reporting some funky issue and we can't duplicate it, right? I don't know how you got that to happen. So with something like Redux, we can actually persist their state to a database, and then we could pull it up and step through what steps they went through to get to a certain point. So it's actually a very handy tool. So from development, though, as you're building stuff, you know that stuff has to go through a certain path. It has to go to the Redux state tree, and then your React component listens to that to be re-rendered. So all we've done so far, Redux is working, only a few lines of code, and React router is listening to that just with one line. So we say history, we say listen to the history, right? And React router knows what to do. So very cool stuff. So here with this one line, so we told React router to pass the history through, and this one line syncs the history with the store. So very, very easy stuff. And then you get the power of Redux. So next one, any other questions on that? Does Redux kind of make sense? Maybe? Yeah. Yeah, you could. So, yeah, I mean, basically, it's just in this case, it's just a JSON object. So you could send that to a database. You could send it, you could have events go to Google Analytics. You could do whatever you want. Anything you could do with JavaScript with it, really, you could do. And one good thing to note, good thing about knowing how Redux works, a lot of stuff in the WordPress ecosystem is using it. So Calypso, WordPress.com, uses Redux for its state management. Jetpack, the new Jetpack plugin, uses Redux for its state management. So if you're running Jetpack in the admin, you got Redux in the WordPress admin already. So yeah. So it's a good thing to know. Yeah. So next one, we're going to look at actually composing some components and creating a layout now. So if you remember in the finished product, we have this navigation bar, and then 2 routes. The home page doesn't use it. Let me zoom back out of this. So the home page doesn't use it, so we don't have this navigation bar, but our two other pages do. So we have the movies page and the movie detail page. So very much like a WordPress theme, right? You might have a home page that has a certain look, and you might have a blog page that has a different look, right? So very similar in React, we can compose components to create layouts. So we'll do that really quickly. So over on in our files, I've gone ahead and created a couple new pages. So we have our home page that we started with. Now I created a file for movie page and another file for movies page, and I created another component called page layout. So let's take a look how we use those. So first thing we're going to do is import those components. So we can just uncomment these lines, which I've already got set up. So now we're importing, instead of the movie page and movies page that we created in our app or our index file, now we're going to import from elsewhere. So now we're importing them from the files I've already created for you. But now we see this error because now we have duplicate definitions of movie page and movies page. So we need to just delete the ones we already had. So number 2 here, it says delete the movie page and movies page component. So I'll delete that. Now we're back to error-free over on the right side because we only have one definition of those components, and that's the definition that we're importing. So last step is to add a route that wraps our movie pages. So this is all commented out here, so you could just copy it. So we're going to wrap our two components, so movies and movies page. We just close that route here, and we can indent that in. So if we zoom back out, now we should be at the same point. I can click Explore Films. Let's refresh that. Let's see. Might have an error on the movies page. Let's go take a look. Okay, this is where we should be. So now the movies page is actually nested in a layout. Cool. All right, so let's go back home. So now we can click Explore Films, and since we nested in the home page or in the index.js file, we nested. Let me zoom back in. So we nested the page layout here to wrap our movies page or our movies route and our movie detail route. So that easily we add this layout around it. Let's take a look at what the layout component looks like. So page layout, stuff we've already looked at. It just imports some dependencies and then it creates a styled component. So we create this menu bar, which adds a background of red. This could be anything though. It could be, green, could be blue, could be whatever we want. Just regular CSS. So we create that. Put it back to the regular color. All right. Then we create a wrapper, which is just the black wrapper that wraps the content. We add the background and the height and some properties to that. And then very easily we just add a couple links to browse movies and home. And then we pass what's called the children. So in React, by default, if you nest components, React will pass it to the component as children. So in this case, we're just saying inside the content, render the children. The children get there from the router where we nested it. So this page layout is the parent. These two routes are the children. So React is taking those children and rendering them. And React router, since our router pays attention to the history and knows what URL we're at, it knows what child to to render. So it has two children, but it's only going to render the one that matches the route that we're at. Does that make sense? Kind of. Right. So the page layout, yeah, is just a very, very simple component. We have a couple styled components to create some styles. Then we add the links to the other routes. So then that should have some code. I must have missed a step. Building this. Sorry about that. All right. So at this point, this movie page should have had some code in here. I must not have saved it when I was building this out, so I apologize. So we can go to the next one. But basically all we do is the exact same thing we did with the movies page. We just moved it from the index file to its own file. All right, so I think I didn't save one of my steps. So at this point, we should have been slightly further along and had this grid build out, but it looks like I might not have saved that in codesandbox properly. So that is in the written tutorial though, it's not missing there. So just transferring everything to codesandbox, so it looks like I missed a step. So at this point though, we should have a grid with no data. It's just gonna be a blank grid with gray placeholder images and text that says like movie title. So now we need to populate that with some data. I've already mentioned that we have that data in WordPress, right? We have it stored in WordPress as posts. But we have this JavaScript application, right? It knows nothing about WordPress. So it's we're not building a PHP theme where we can easily just query data from WordPress with WP query, right? So what do? Of course, we use GraphQL. Obvious answer would probably be the REST API, but so I'm going to show you what GraphQL is. Anybody heard of GraphQL? Heard of it? Have you used it? You've heard of it? Have you used it? Sweet. So this is an intro for everybody. Sweet. So GraphQL is a query language for your API. So GraphQL is a query language for your APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with your existing data. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API, gives clients the power to ask for exactly what they want and nothing more. It makes it easier to evolve APIs over time, and it enables powerful developer tools. So I'll recap that really quick. It's a query language for APIs using existing data, like WordPress data, perhaps. It's a complete and understandable description of the data in your API. So it relies on a type system and a schema. You define what types of data exist in your API, and it uses that to build a contract between the client and the server. The client controls the model or the shape of data that it wants, and it only gets exactly what it's asked for and in the shape that it asks for it. Where REST, for GraphQL is very similar to REST in some ways, in that you can send an HTTP request to a server, get data back in JSON, but REST, the server controls the model of data, so REST endpoint defines what data will be returned to you, whether you want it or not. You say, give me posts, you get whatever that might mean, whether you want it all or not. With GraphQL, you specify up front what you want, and you get back what you need. And we'll look at this. GraphQL enables easier versioning and powerful tooling, which we'll look at later as well. So I'll talk a little bit about what the GraphQL query language looks like, and then we'll do some demos of that, and then we'll look at tying in that data with our React application to populate it with some data from WordPress. So GraphQL query, this is kind of the hello world of GraphQL query. Can everybody see this? Is that okay? Okay. So over here we have GraphQL query. This is kind of the hello world. You say, it looks kind of like JSON, right? So we're saying, give me, and on me, give me the name, and you would get something that looks like this back. It would be a JSON object. We would get some data back and the shape that we asked for. We asked for me and my name. We get back me and my name. So this is a slightly more complex example. I'll zoom in a little bit. So here we're saying get a post. On the post, I'm going to pass an ID, so I'm going to pass an argument to this. It'll be whatever ID I'm asking for the post of. And on that post, we're going to ask for a title, a link, and maybe the bylines or the authors. If there's a plugin called Bylines, so yeah. Assuming you were using that with GraphQL supported for it, you could ask for bylines, and each byline you might ask for the name. Your response might look something like this. I ask for the post, so I get back the post. I ask for the title, I get back the title. I ask for the link, I get back the link. I ask for the bylines. In this case, I get an array of bylines, and on each one, I get the name. So I have an array of bylines named John Doe and Jane Doe. So me as the consumer or the application developer, I can ask for what data I need for my application based on an agreement the server has made by way of a GraphQL schema. I get back exactly what I asked for. I'm not getting a bunch of stuff I don't need. One thing a lot of people ask when I talk about GraphQL, what does GraphQL mean? Oh, let me step back a second too. GraphQL is a spec that Facebook open sourced. So Facebook actually uses GraphQL in production. They have been since 2012. Any requests you make on Facebook, whether it's the desktop app, the native app, or web app, native app, iOS, Android, versions all the way back to 2012. So I think they have like 1,000 or something iOS versions in that time period. All GraphQL, the same GraphQL endpoint. So also there are other apps like Facebook for Business or Facebook Ads Manager, all using GraphQL. They found it really helpful internally, so just like with React, they open sourced it. They open sourced a spec, though. It's not a piece of technology. They just open sourced a language spec. And then community around that created implementations in different languages. So in my case, we're using a PHP implementation that we've tied into WordPress. There's Java implementations, JavaScript implementations, which Facebook actually manages JavaScript reference implementation. There's Scala, Ruby, Python, Node, basically any language you could think of, Go, basically any language you could think of, there's a GraphQL library for that you can take advantage of and build stuff on. In my case, I've made a WordPress plugin, WPGraphQL. It's on GitHub. You can get it. That brings it to WordPress. So GraphQL, though, let me clarify this. GraphQL does not have anything to do with graph databases like Neo4j or any graph database. It also does not have anything to do with Facebook's feature Graph Search, which they implemented on Facebook.com, I think 2 or 3 years ago, which was an API for you to search Facebook data. Even though they're both Facebook products, they're not the same thing. Graph in GraphQL stands for Application Data Graph, and QL stands for Query Language. So you can use this query language to query data in your application data graph. Your application data graph depends on what your application is. And we'll look at what an application data graph in WordPress might look like. So if you're not familiar with graphs of data, which I imagine a lot of people may or probably aren't, I don't know. So in a graph of data, there's not really a beginning or an end. There's just entry points. So we have nodes of data. Those data have what's called edges, where other data exists, and then those nodes also have properties that resolve to concrete data. So in WordPress, we have a node like a post, right? And a post might have properties like a title, and that title might resolve to concrete piece of data like hello world. That post might have a byline or an author, right? And that byline might have properties like a name, and that name might resolve to some concrete data like Jane Doe. Maybe two people. I work for a publishing company, so it's pretty common that we have multiple reporters working on the same article. So in many cases, we have an article that gets published. We have two authors or two bylines. So we have a post, byline Jane Doe, but the other author, byline John Doe. But authors also write multiple articles. right? So Jane Doe might have helped write Hello World, but maybe she also helped write Goodbye Mars. I don't know. So this is what a graph of data in simple terms in WordPress looks like, right? There's not a start or an end, right? We can enter at any of these points and get to the other ones. So this is kind of what a graph of data looks like in WordPress. So GraphQL lets us pick trees out of that graph. So that's what the query I showed you before. Now with that graph model in mind, let's think about this again. So we had the graph of data. In this case, we're going to say, give me a post. I'm going to give you this ID for the post. That's going to be our entry point into our graph of data. Give me that post. On that post, I want the title, I want the link, and I want the bylines. So we get back Hello World. We get the link to the Hello World article, and we get the bylines. We know from the graph that the two bylines on that are John Doe and Jane Doe. So now we have those nodes that are connected to the post, and we have the name John Doe and Jane Doe. So let's take a look at how that looks in the graph again. So we have our data graph again. We asked for the post. We asked for the bylines. So we got that. The grayed out part is what we didn't ask for and we didn't get. So I mentioned it's plucking trees out of a graph. It doesn't look like a tree. So let's take that exact same graphic and make it look like a tree. So we have our post, our bylines with their properties. Does that make sense? Well, I'll do some demos and it might make more sense in a minute. Does anybody have questions on that right now? Cool. So what's happening, like I mentioned, so it's a WordPress plugin. So what's happening when we make these GraphQL queries to WordPress, we send a query, and then these fields inside the query are what's called a selection set. So on our root query, we ask for a post, our selection set post with a certain ID, and then on the post we can ask for title, which is a selection set on the post node. So this is what GraphQL is doing. It's running a root query. It's going to resolve the post, and then it's going to resolve any fields on the post. So in GraphQL or in PHP and WordPress, in the actual plugin, when the request hits WordPress, it's going to run a function do GraphQL request. It's going to figure out what we're asking for. In this case, it's going to say, hey, we're asking for a post. Let's resolve that. WordPress knows how to resolve that, right? If you pass an ID to WordPress with get post, it can get a post object. So behind the scenes, we're taking that ID from the GraphQL query, we're getting a post, and then we're simply resolving a post title. So it's not doing a whole lot of magic that WordPress can't do already, other than parsing the query. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. It's at least at the moment it's opt-in, like the REST API. So the rest, and I can talk about that. I don't actually have a slide for that, but I can talk about that later. But yeah, so REST API to enable post type support there, you do like show and rest equals true in the post type definition. Same thing here, it's post show and GraphQL true. And then there's two additional properties, single name and plural name. So GraphQL underscore single name, GraphQL underscore plural name. But I can actually show code at the end if we have time. I can actually do that. So I mentioned that the client controls the model. So let's take a look at what building potentially a React component with GraphQL query might look like. This is, let's see, I thought I had the end. I'm going to have to step through this. Okay, so this is the end result. This is a screenshot of something in Calypso, WordPress.com. This is an actual live component, right? It's a grid of 4 articles that have different properties, like a title, an author, a follow link, a featured image in some cases, an excerpt, right? So let's look at how we would build that in GraphQL. So we could send a query and say, hey, I want some posts. On those posts, I want an author. On that author, I want the name, I want the avatar, and I want a specific size. I can pass an argument saying, give me the size 50 of the avatar, and what I need back is just the URL. That's all I want back. I don't need anything else. So with that part of the query, we can build this part of the component. Then we can say, hey, I need the site that this post belongs to, because in Calypso, right, you're looking at, in WordPress.com, you're looking at content from across the internet, right? So it's not just a specific WordPress site. So we could say, I need the site, and I need the name of the site, and the link of the site, or the URL, or whatever the schema might be defined as. Then I can ask for the follow link, and you'll see that's what the data will need to build out the follow link. I need the title. I need the featured image. I want it to be the width of 300, and I want the URL so I can render it, and then the excerpt. So I ask for exactly what I need. I get a payload of data back from the server that consists of just the data that I asked for, and now I can build out a component because I have the data that I need to build out the component. And the structure of my request looks very much like the structure of my React component might. I might easily have an author component, a site component, a featured image component, right? So the shape of my data looks like the shape of my application now. So it's very easy to reason about down the road when you're trying to maintain an application, where something like a REST endpoint, if you're getting your data over REST, you would get here and say, okay, how's this component built? Okay, they hit a post endpoint, and they hit an author endpoint, and they hit a site endpoint, and they hit a media endpoint. What's coming from where? And then there's some layer in your client-side application to transform that data from a REST response to your client-side application. So it gets really messy to maintain over a long period of time. Also, yeah, okay, so demo time. Sweet. All right, so my first slide, if you were here early enough, I mentioned downloading a tool called GraphQL. So there's a desktop tool for Mac. You can Google just graphical desktop. It'll take you to GitHub repo. There's a one-line command to download it as an app. Or there's a Chrome extension. You could go to the Chrome extension store, search. I think if you just search GraphQL in the Chrome extensions, you'll find it. I think the official name is Chrome IQL, Chromical. So I have a WordPress site, a public WordPress site set up, https learn.wpgraphql.com/GraphQL. If you have this tool on your desktop, you could point it there. Make sure the method here is changed to post, and then you will have access to this GraphQL endpoint. So, and I will demo how this all works. So all I'm doing, so you can see, I'll actually log in here. So this is learn.wpgraphql.com. I've got 3 plugins. One is JSON Basic Auth, which is a REST API plugin, which GraphQL plays nice with. I'll actually deactivate these just so you can. Then I have WPGraphQL, which actually brings this graphical tool to WordPress, which I'll show in a second. And then I have GraphQL. So if I open this GraphQL tool and go to this endpoint, with that plugin deactivated, I'm going to see all sorts of errors. Alright, so I got an error because I don't have an endpoint. I just deactivated the plugin. If I activate the plugin, nothing changes in my admin. I just have this plugin activated. If you haven't already, once you activate it, you just need to flush the permalinks, which is what? Under settings, permalinks. I think you just need to visit the page, but we'll save it just for good measure. So now that we have the plugin activated, I have GraphQL endpoint. I can point this tool to my site /GraphQL. We'll see up here on the right-hand side, there's a documentation explorer. I can open that up, and we can see what schema is available on my site. So this is just the core plugin active. So very similar to the REST API, we have the core WordPress data available. So we have things like categories or single category, comment or comments, media items, node, which is a special query I'll show in a minute, pages, plugins, posts, post tags, themes, users. So very powerful stuff. And then in any of these things, we can click in and see what fields are available on them, right? So we know right away from a tool like this what we can ask the server for, what type of data it would be. So like, let's say a category, category has these properties to return to us. Category ID, which is an integer, it tells us right here, you as a consumer should expect an integer when I return data to you. The count is also going to be an integer. The description is going to be a string. The ID is going to be a non-null string or a required field. Like that piece of data is going to be there, right? So we already know ahead of time. So when I'm building apps, I know what data exists on the server that I can ask for through tools like this. So let's take a look. I'm going to switch back and forth from my slides to see. So documentation, I just showed built-in documentation when you extend the GraphQL schema. I'll show you a little bit later what it looks like, but each field that you register has description built into the schema definition that tools like this can read. So documentation is built in. It's a first-class citizen of GraphQL. If you manage the REST API, I know one of the biggest frustrations for our team, we use the REST API very heavily where I work, and one of the biggest frustrations with us is maintaining documentation for our custom endpoints and even core endpoints as they change. Or even, for example, like the REST API is version 2 by the time it even made it to core. We were using it long before that, so transitioning from version 1 to version 2 has been interesting because documentation wasn't always consistent, so sometimes we're, wait, was that version 1 or version 2? Like, it's very difficult to maintain code base using REST. So let's look at querying post lists. So kind of like my example, let me zoom in again. I'll close this documentation. Clear all this. Comments. All right, so to start, we can just start with brackets. That's gonna, by default, run a query. Then we can ask for anything, and it's got type ahead. So I can just start typing, and it knows what's available as an entry point to the graph of data. So we want to do a list of posts. By default, it's going to give us 10 posts, but we can pass in arguments to get more or less, which I'll show in a minute. So posts, it uses the shape edges and node. So on the post, we want the edges. The edges in GraphQL, if you can remember the graphic that I shared, I'll just bring it back up real quick. Oop. Where was it? There we go. So on a graph of data, we have nodes, and then we have edges. Edges is that like yellow dotted line here. It's that space between nodes. So if you think of WordPress, think of if WordPress had term relationship meta, if that was a thing, which it's not. But data that exists only in the context of a relationship between two objects. So a common example would be Facebook and friends. Like, let's say I'm a Facebook user and you're a Facebook user. We're friends on Facebook. There's some data that's not a property of you or me, things like friends since. Like, we've been friends since 2008. That's not a property of me as a user or you as a user. It's only a property of the relationship between us. So if WordPress had term relationship meta, which may or may not happen, if I have anything to say with it at some point, but if that existed, that would be the edge of data. And you could probably come up with creative uses right now with WordPress, but that's one potential example. And I guarantee you're already doing it with post meta or term meta already. You're probably storing, or a lot of people probably are, storing data like that. So that's what edges is. So when you see the term edges and node, that's what it's referring to. So edges is the space between things. So that in this case, it's the space between our entry point and an individual node. So I can ask for on the node, let's say we want an ID, maybe we want the link and the title. I don't know, what else do we want? The date or something like that. So I can run this request. It's going to go hit up my GraphQL endpoint, give me back just the data I asked for in the shape that I asked for it. So by default, it's going to give me 10 items. And this is that same database, so it's got a bunch of superhero data. So we're seeing being Batman, Return of the Caped Crusaders, and whatnot. You'll notice, though, this ID doesn't look like a WordPress ID, right? It's no WordPress ID I've ever seen. So we can get the WordPress ID as well. So we can just say, give me the post ID too. That's the actual WordPress ID. This ID is a global unique ID, which allows us to do some powerful stuff like node queries. So at the root, I can write a node query. Oops. And I can pass an ID. That ID can be of any type. GraphQL will know how to resolve that. So I can say, if this ID I'm passing is a post, if that ID is a post, I want these fields. I want the ID, the title, and the link. So if it's a post, I want the ID, the title, and link. If it's not a post, I don't want that. So let's just change the ID to some random thing that I know is not an ID. It's going to give me an error, right? But let's go get some pages and take a page ID. So we can also query pages. Actually, this install doesn't have pages, so that's not going to work. But we can do users. Sure. So I can get a list of users and their IDs, so I can take this ID. Let's go back and do the node query with that. So I can pass an ID. I can have, in my query itself, I can have conditions now. I can say on user, give me, I don't know, let's say the name and the ID. So we're in my query itself, I can say, if this ID is a user, I want these two fields. If it's a post, I want this other field. So again, I can just swap out that user with a post ID. So same thing, exact same query. Now I'm getting a post with the post attributes I asked for. We can actually extract these and call them fragments. So we'll just call this like post data. And then we can plug that in here. So same thing, so I extracted this part of my query as a fragment. What's powerful about this now, we looked at how we compose components in React. We can also compose our queries in our React files. So I can create a component that displays the ID, the title, and the link, and I can store that fragment in the same file in my application. So now we already looked at having the markup that renders in our React component and the styles that style our component. Now we can actually have the query that queries our data. So we can actually have one file that manages where we get the data, what it looks like, and what markup is rendered all in one file. So that's pretty powerful because all I need to do is reference that fragment from anywhere in my application inside this query. So if my higher order component knows about it, it can query. So I can structure my application with all the stuff coupled right where it should be. So long-term maintenance of an application, as a developer, I don't have to search around some complicated structure to find out where potentially complicated things are happening. So my data fetching layer can now be coupled with my component. My presentation layer can be coupled with it. It's very powerful stuff. What else? All right, so variables. So one thing you can do in GraphQL is actually pass variables. So we will query, we'll give the query a name like, let me change this back to post. We can give the query a name like get posts. We'll do the same query we were doing earlier. Edges, node. On each node I want an ID. Say a title and a link. So what we're going to do here is define a variable. So in GraphQL, we can say first should be an integer, and we're going to use that here. And then here in the graphical tool, we have a place where we can define our variables. So I can say first one. So what this is going to do, this query, we're going to say get post. It's expecting a variable to come through. That variable is an integer, and I think that's actually a mistake. That doesn't need to be there, I don't think. So it's saying this variable, if you see the variable first, treat it as an integer. If it is, use it at this part of the query, which is the post selection set. So we're going to select post. We're going to ask for the first X amount of posts, which in our case is going to be 1. And then we're going to ask for this data. So if I run this, we should get 1 post back. We got 1 post back. I can change this variable to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever I want. By default, out of the box, GraphQL is going to stop at 100 just to make sure your server doesn't go crazy. But you as a developer on your system, you can override that through a filter. So if you wanted your server to be able to return more than 100 items, you can. But by default, if you install the plugin, the max amount of posts or objects somebody can query is 100. But so yeah, I could pass a variable of 5. The benefit of this now is that my query is a string. It's a static string. There's no dynamic part of my query. So my server can actually cache that query, give me an ID, and then for future requests, I can just send a request to the server with an ID, which minimizes the amount of data that passes from the client to the server. So the way Facebook actually in-house does things, that's exactly how they do it actually. In the development cycle, they have their client-side developers working on components, and they cache these queries in development, and then they whitelist those for production. And if somebody tried to send a malicious query or a query that just wasn't supported by their whitelist, they don't even attempt to execute it. So their server only gets hit by queries that they've said should be hit. So that's one thing that you couldn't potentially do if variables were part of the string itself, because anytime you change the ID, it's a unique string, right? So they extract variables into a different part. And the actual request, if we look at what this tool is sending, if we look at the network tool, the way it sends it to the server, we have a couple parameters here. We have the operation name, which is this name that I added here. We have a static string, which is the query itself. And then we have variables as a JSON object or as a string. So when GraphQL gets it, it's going to say, hey, there's some variables. Cool, I need to populate that. First, it's going to validate those variables. So if I tried to pass a variable that wasn't an integer, you can already actually see I get the red squiggly down there. It's already validating on the client. I'm not even sending a query, and it knows you're not allowed to send me a string for this, right? So GraphQL, when it goes process, it's going to validate the variables, know if it's even safe to process, right? Like if I send a script tag or something to try and do something nasty to your server, it's going to know ahead of time, like, hey, bro, you said this is supposed to be an integer. You're trying to send me some nasty stuff, right? So it never even attempts to execute, right? Unless you're sending data that it's expecting to be sent. What else? So variables. So nested relations, another very powerful thing in GraphQL, right? Like I mentioned, like authors, right, which are other objects in a WordPress GraphQL or in a WordPress application data graph. So authors in WordPress we know are stored in a different table completely, right? In the REST API, if you wanted post and authors, you got to hit a post endpoint, then an author endpoint. So you're making multiple HTTP requests. Here we're sending one request. We're saying I want the posts, I want a list of posts, I want their authors, and I don't know, I want the username and their ID or something like that. So to build my application, I can get this related data from one HTTP request instead of making multiple round trips. And guess what? Authors also have posts, right? So I can go on. So I can ask for posts and their nodes and their IDs and their titles and their links. Right? So now I can get a list of posts with the author, a list of the author's posts with their data. So depending on what application I'm building, I can do some pretty powerful stuff. And if you're using the REST API, any application you build, and this isn't unique to WordPress REST API, this is just REST in general. If you're using REST to consume data, every single application you build has to figure out the logic on how to consume data. Here, the server does it for you. So you can rapidly build new applications with very minimal client-side effort. Side note, you can also run these queries inside of PHP. So you can actually be in WordPress and run queries too. So if you wanted to build your home page, you could have at the top of your index.php file a GraphQL query that gets everything you need. Potentially even your menu, your whatever, list of posts, and then render that in template parts. So just side note. So we're looking at nested queries, nested relations. I'm going to skip these two. Pages are very similar to posts, so I'm going to skip that mostly because this install doesn't have pages. Multiple root queries. So again, I can actually write multiple root queries. So I can ask for posts, their edges, and node, ID, title, and link. But let's say for whatever UI I'm building, maybe the UI I needs, let's say, a list of posts. If you're at like Jacob's talk yesterday, he built the search app, right? It has a list of posts, but it also had a list of categories, right, that you can filter by. So instead of making multiple requests to get the categories and the posts, I can make one network request. So I can say, give me a list of categories, give me their nodes, give me the category ID, the link, maybe what is a name, and maybe just for giggles I want details about what taxonomy it's part of. I don't know. I already know it's the categories, but for some reason. So I can, oh, I left my variable in there. See, validation, didn't even try to execute. So here, I don't have any categories. Let me do it with post tags, actually. Because I actually have data in there. So here I'm sending one HTTP request. I'm saying, give me a list of post tags. Give me their ID, their link, their tag, details about the taxonomy. Like maybe I want, what's a good thing on taxonomy? Labels or something? Or the GraphQL plural name, like you were asking for. So I can ask for different properties, right? Or show and rest, for example. We can ask, like, is this taxonomy available in REST? I don't know. Whatever you want to know. So we're asking for a list of post tags. We're getting it back. In the same request, we're also getting a list of posts in the same request. So I sent one HTTP request. I get one HTTP response. And if you're looking at the network tab, the speed is pretty quick. Come on. So yeah, I mean, a couple hundred milliseconds. If we look at the size of the payload, 3.7 kilobytes to get all that data, which is tiny. If we compare that to, let's say, we'll look at the exact same WordPress site, and we'll just hit the post endpoint. Let's check that out in the network tab. 23 kilobytes, so what? We're almost 10 times the size. Right? So what were we? 3.7 kilobytes. We're getting multiple resources, but we're only getting the data that we asked for. Where did my Chrome go? Oh, did I just accidentally quit Chrome? Oops. Sorry about that. So I could get multiple requests. So in this case, like I mentioned, we're getting multiple requests. I'm getting a list of 10 tags, a list of 10 posts. My payload's 10 times smaller than just getting a list of 10 posts from the REST API. So when you're talking about building things like native apps where speed and upload and download time really matters, not only like from physical cost savings, but also from time cost savings, this becomes really helpful. So yeah, let's look at that again. So yeah, 23.1 kilobytes versus the 3. So yeah, all right. So it's pretty powerful stuff. So node query I mentioned. Aliasing is also a very powerful thing you can do in GraphQL. So in GraphQL, what if I built a React component and I built it with the term, I don't know, like in our case, we're building a movies app. So we want a list of movies. In WordPress, it's stored as posts, but in my component, I wrote it to be called movies. So I can actually here tell the query, when I query for these posts, come back to me called movies. I don't want it to be called posts. So I'm going to delete this post tag part. So I can actually send that. When we get the request or the response back, now it's actually called movies in the response. So if my component that I built for something else already is expecting a list of movies, now I don't have to do any transformation in my React application. It already has movies. So I can do that with any field. So I can say like unique ID, like maybe we have a need to be called that, or post title because I have something else that used to be called that, and URL. Right? I can do this with any field. and I'm going to get back movies, unique ID, post title, URL. It can be any field. Node maybe doesn't make sense. Maybe I want that to be called movie, and maybe instead of items, I want it to be, or instead of edges, items. So now I get back a list of movies, the items in that list, and the movie with whatever I want it to be called. So I don't have to do this transformation on the client, which is powerful. With something like REST, again, if you don't like the naming, you have to figure out a way to change it from the REST response to your data, and every single client application you use that consumes that has to figure that logic out again. Here, the server's doing it for you. I already mentioned fragments, another powerful thing. So not only can we query data, we can also query the schema. So there's super powerful tools like this. So this will give us what's called an introspection query. I'm going to close this variables portion. So this is what's called an introspection query. I can run this and get all the available types in my schema, what types of fields they have, what types of data, whether it's a string or an integer or another type in my system that it will resolve to. And that's how tools like this are built. They run this introspection query. I can also then take the results of that, so I can take the results of this, paste it into a tool like this, which is actually going to give us like a map of the data in WordPress, right? This is just an open source tool, has nothing to do with WordPress, right? It's just because GraphQL is a spec, so the whole world is building tools around the spec. Or not the whole world, but a lot of people. So yeah, I can dump it into a tool like this, and now I can get rich introspection into what my system looks like, right? So I think, does anybody have any question on any questions on any of those demos, or is there anything like, does it do this, or? One thing we're actually going to look at, I'll do one more. So pagination. So we looked at how to get a list of posts, but how do you paginate through that data? Because that's probably important, right? So I mentioned you could ask for like the first amount of something, right? So we can ask for the first, like, I don't know, 5 posts. We'll do that without a variable, but ideally this would be a variable. First post, and then we can actually ask on the on our edges, sorry, before our edges, same level, we can ask for page info, like has next page, has previous page, start cursor, and end cursor. Is anybody familiar with cursors in paginating data? So a cursor is just a reference to a point in a set of data. So when we ask for this, it's going to give us this funky looking string, right? That's a reference. It's a base 64 encoded string that just references where in our data set we are queried. So here we're asking for 10 items. I can actually put a cursor on each one so you can see. So we can query for a cursor on every item. So we'll get a cursor here. The first cursor, the start cursor, we'll see here, matches this one, the first item. And the end cursor is going to match this one. So now we can ask for this data, say, where in the data set am I? And then we can use that cursor to paginate either data before that point in the data set or after that point in the data set. So I can say, give me the first pieces of data before this cursor. So here we're going to see we have Being Batman, Batman Return of the Caped Crusaders, now all the way down to what, Lego DC Comics Superheroes Justice League, right? So that's our most recent data that we have on our data set. I want the 5 items before that. So kind of like page 2 of a blog. I want the data that happened before that. So I can say, give me the first 5, or I think either one will work, but it's actually last 5 would be appropriate. So give me the last 5, so the 5 that happened before that. So now you'll see I got 5 different objects, and I got a cursor back with that. Oops, start cursor. Yeah, yeah. So same thing, I can keep passing cursors all day long, keep getting data that happened before that in the data set. So behind the scenes, this is still using WP query to resolve this data in WordPress. Do have a filter on it. The plugin adds a filter to the query to support cursor pagination. And default, the WP query uses what is it, post per page and a page number to paginate through data, or you can do an offset if you get funky enough. The problem with offset and pagination based or default like post per page pagination is that it actually counts a byte per item that it has to skip in the database. Well, here it just references a specific spot and starts there. It doesn't actually skip the data before. So on large data sets like ours, like for example, like the Denver Post or Orange County Register, we have something like over 1 million articles published, right? So if you want to paginate deep into our data set, you know, like page 8,000 or something, you're skipping 80,000 articles. It's 80 whatever bytes. That's a lot of stuff to paginate through. Here we actually reference a spot and start there. We don't have to calculate the bytes to skip or offset data. So this is actually a lot more efficient, which if you paginate through this versus REST API, you'll actually notice, especially on large data sets, that pagination becomes slow in REST. It even becomes slow just in the WP query and in your theme if you get deep with pagination. So this actually avoids that. So that's what pagination looks like. So what you would do is you would store this variable, whatever your start or end cursor was, and then use that to go forward or backward. And we'll actually look in a second at how hooking into Apollo does that to manage that. What time do I get to go to? Okay, so cool. Doing all right. Any questions still on that? All good? All right, so now we're actually going to connect GraphQL to the components we built. So now we have React. Now we know a little bit about GraphQL. We have this GraphQL WordPress install that is pulling data, you know, superhero data. So let's look at hooking that up. All right. So next we're gonna, so on the index file, we'll step 1 says to go update the state index file. So under state index.js, this has a couple steps in here. So first thing we're going to do is import the Apollo client dependency. Apollo is a client-side state manager specifically built for managing managing GraphQL queries, and then it uses Redux as well to store the data. So when you make a GraphQL query with Apollo, it stores the data in Redux, and then it can then reread data out of your Redux store instead of communicating with your server again. So we'll see what that looks like in a minute. So we'll import this dependency. Next we configure, we just uncomment these lines here. So this configures the Apollo client. So what we're doing here is we create what's called a network interface, and we pass it the URL to our GraphQL endpoint, which is learn.wpgraphql.com, learn.wpgraphql.com/GraphQL. Same endpoint we're using in the graphical tool here. So we tell it to use that endpoint. And then the reducer that we had for the router to store data in Redux, we just need to add that here. So Redux can now be aware of things Apollo is doing for us, or that we're doing with Apollo. So now we have our Redux in just 3 lines. I uncommented 2 lines and added 1 line. 3 lines of code. We have Apollo hooked up to Redux. So now we need to add it to our app, right? So now we already took care of step 1, which was fixing the state file. Now we import Apollo provider, which is a component that is going to wrap the rest of our components. So we have the Apollo provider here, and now we're going to wrap that. So we just copy this code here, and we wrap our router. So it's going to give us an error because we don't have it closed. Did I do that right? Oh. So very easily, no visual difference yet. Let's make sure we save that. Cool, let's save. All right. So if we look at that though, with our Redux dev tools, which isn't. So if we look at Redux DevTools, this is the finished product. All right. Okay, so here we can see, like, let me refresh this again. So we can see Apollo storing stuff in Redux here. So it's going to store rich data, like what queries we've ran, what data was retrieved back. I'm not going to get into too much detail about this, but just know that Apollo stores stuff in Redux. You can browse it using Redux DevTools. You can step back and forth. You can see very powerful what like your state tree overall looks like as a tree of data. Let's see if it's pretty zoomed. Yeah, so it's storing all sorts of rich data. We have one query or two queries so far going at this point, and storing all this data about our application that we can make use of later in our app. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about that right now. But just know it's doing a lot of cool stuff that we can make use of. Oops. Maybe. All right. So since it uses Redux Apollo, you get the full power of the Redux DevTools. So yeah, at this point we've connected Redux or Apollo to Redux, but we haven't done anything with it yet. So let's go to the next step where we'll actually do something with it. So now we've got Apollo hooked up. We can open up this one, and we'll actually be able to just pull a query directly from the graphical tool that we're using, since it's just a string, and paste it into our app and use an Apollo higher order component to connect the results to our component. So let's move to, we're going to go into the components movies page. So this, at this point, if we look at this page now, this is where we should have ended before I started talking about GraphQL. So it should just be a grid of placeholder data. So close this. All right, so this is what it looks like at this point. We have our styled components. They're all laid out as a grid, what they're going to be. It's even responsive, kind of. So now we just need to connect that data to use GraphQL. So there's two steps in this movies page, I think two. Yeah, so we're going to replace this movie card component with one that actually renders data. So we can just delete this, uncomment. I have one pre-written here. So here what this component is doing, it's going to break right now because it doesn't have the data yet. What I'm doing though, I'm getting data out of React props to render into the component. So up at the top we have a render method that's going to render the component. Up at the top I'm setting some variables. I'm saying get the movie out of the props that are passed down from it. Let's set the poster URL as a default, just placeholder gray image. But if the movie that we're iterating over has a poster URL, let's use that instead. And then we render out a card component, which has some styles applied to it as well. It links to the movie using the movie ID, and then it sets the image with the poster URL, an alt attribute, and then the actual title. But right now we're getting this error because this data is not defined. This component doesn't have this data. We need to get that data from GraphQL. So very easily, sorry about that, missed one step. So that's the movie card. This is the movie list. So the movie list takes the GraphQL query results, which is going to include a list of movies, it's gonna here it's gonna take that list of movies, use what's called a map function to iterate over that data, and then it'll render that movie card, which we just looked at, which outputs the poster as an image, the title, and it's wrapped in a link. So now we have this. Let's delete the movies page, the old one. All right, now this is where the magic happens. It's nothing crazy. We can take this. We can take this query, test it in GraphQL here. Make sure it's getting the data we want, right? So I'm contesting a tool like this and say, okay, I'm getting back data. I'm getting back a list of movies, the edges. On each edge, I'm getting a movie, an ID, a title, a poster, and on the poster, I get a URL. This looks like the data I need to populate this app, right? So I can test in a tool like this. I can even, as a side note, I can even hook up like GitHub to run this query when I submit a pull request to make sure my queries aren't broken before I even merge code into my application, because queries can be validated ahead of time. So you can actually save yourself from writing bad code, or your teammates from writing bad code, because GraphQL is cool like that. But yeah, so yeah, you can test a query like this. Since it's just a static string, I can come and paste it directly here, right? And then that's my query here. We use one thing. We're going to replace this export line here. So all we do here is use this helper function called GraphQL from Apollo. It's going to take our movies query here, which is our static string query, and it's going to connect it to our movies page component, which is the component that renders. Save that. Oh, what do we got? Line 90, I got something it doesn't like. Oh, there we go, maybe. Sorry about that. I was missing the word class before our component. All right, so class, movies page component takes that. So we got this component that renders data. Now we have a query that goes and fetches data, and then Apollo connects that data to our component. So let's open this up in DevTools. So now we can use React DevTools. Just gonna do it here. So we have React DevTools, and we can see what Apollo is passing to this component now. So we have like our movies list. So we can see the movies list now has this data attribute. So Apollo is going to connect now our data from the query to this component. It comes with a helper called loading, so we can actually, if loading is true, we can render like a spinner. When Apollo knows it's finished, it sets loading to false, so we can render our data. And then we'll see here we have this data, or in my case I changed it to, yeah, so we have data loading, and then since we queried for movies, right, in our GraphQL query, we said, give it to me called movies. So it's going to be called movies here. Apollo actually adds a hidden field that you can always ask GraphQL for, type name. Apollo adds that to every query so that they can store data in a normalized tree in Redux. So the benefit of that, so now Redux is going to get this data. Apollo is going to sort it in Redux. Redux asks for the type name on every object, so it's going to know if it's a post or a user or a page or a category or a tag or whatever it might be. Now it's also going to know the ID. So now any of our component, no matter where in our app, if that component changes, Redux can store it in just one spot because it knows the type and the ID. So it can be globally unique in our application. So if we change on this interface over here, but we're rendering part of the data over here. That data can mutate in our Redux tree once, and both components can render those changes as they need to. So that's one thing Apollo does. It adds its type name, so we can see what data we got back. On movies, we get the type name. Edges, each of these is our movie. So the movie, we got the ID, we have the poster URL, we have the title. So we have the data we need to populate this interface very easily. So we mess around with this tool, get the query we want, paste it in React, use Apollo to connect it. So very easily, I mean, most of this code is a query string, right? And then I wrote 2 lines of code to connect it. And then Apollo does all this magic for us. Really neat stuff. So let's take a look at this page now. So this page isn't rendering anything because I haven't connected it to render anything, right? It's still just our placeholder data. So let's open up the movie page. I think that is still in this step. It might be the next step. Okay, yeah, it's here. So same thing, let's just replace the movie page component with this. So we can delete movie page. So it's going to give us this error because we're asking to render data from Apollo that we haven't connected yet. So exact same thing we did before. We can add our GraphQL query, which in this case we're going to introduce a variable because we're on a specific page. One thing I did behind the scenes too, I added our link now passes the ID in the URL, so you'll see movie/ID. So we can get that attribute out of React Router, pass that as a variable to our GraphQL query. Now GraphQL query can run, or Apollo can run a GraphQL query to get that data and connect it to this component. So same thing here. We're going to connect this and export it, and then we can delete our other exports. So now we have data here. What's happening, what you might notice though, is we have additional data that we didn't have on our other template. So here we have a title, but we have a release date, which we didn't show on the other layout. And we have the description and the image. So on the other query, we already got the image, or we got the image and the title, but not the release date or the description. So this runs a query that says, give me, the ID, the title, the content, the release date, and the poster image. And then Apollo makes that query, gets it back, and then we connect the variables here. Let's see. So we connect the variables down here. We say, hey Apollo, when you go to run this query, set these variables. If React Router has made available these route params, and one of them is a movie ID, which would be defined when we set up our router at the beginning. We set up movie ID as a dynamic parameter. Oops. Right? So React Router now knows one of our routes has a movie ID parameter. The movie page says, hey, React Router, if the route they come to renders this component, which would be the movie's detail page, and this parameter exists, use it as the value for the ID variable. If not, set it to null, right? It's going to get an error if it was null. This is going to, yeah. If I console log this now, we're going to get an error. It's going to be nasty. So, but if we do have it, it gets the data that we want. So now it's using a variable to say, hey, give me this data. And again, we're doing all this rich querying of data, and we're not in WordPress, right? We're completely decoupled from WordPress, but we're populating everything from WordPress. So very powerful stuff. So now at this point, we almost have a complete app. So we can go, let me refresh that, because it's funky sometimes. So now we can go explore films. We got the loading indicator as it's fetching data. We got a list of items. Can't paginate quite yet, but I can click into one of them. It gets it. If I go back to browse movies now, since my data is in the Redux store, I don't have to make another network request to fetch data. So it's instant. So the data's there. It's all in a Redux. I don't have to ask WordPress again, hey, give me a list of movies. I already got it. You can implement your own logic, like on when you do want to refetch, because there are cases where you will want to refetch and communicate with the server again. But a lot of times in a lot of applications, once you've got the data for the user, they don't need to refetch it constantly every time they change a route. So same thing, I just loaded the full Batman details. If I go back to browse movies and come back to Batman, again, it's instant now, right? So in this case, I haven't fetched the details for the Cape Crusader, so it's fetching them now, returns it, renders it. I can go back, come back, instant again, right? My user experience is going to be a lot faster, because if they change from Route A to Route B and then back to Route A, you don't have to communicate with the server again. So very, very powerful stuff. You can do, Redux is kind of the magic behind that. You can do that with the REST API too, just so you know. That's not only a GraphQL thing. Calypso uses Redux, so Calypso uses REST to get data, and then it populates in a Redux store. So that's not exclusive to GraphQL. GraphQL, in my opinion, just makes it a lot easier to reason about getting that data. So next step, I guess the final step would be adding pagination. Oh, actually customizing our GraphQL schema. One thing you might have seen, I forgot. So this, finally we're going to actually touch some PHP, touch WordPress directly. Right. So one thing you may or may not have noticed, I think I pointed out, we have a release date. That release date, I could have used just the post date, but for example's sake, I stored this post meta just to show how we can extend the GraphQL schema. So I could cowboy code this, but I'm not going to. I already have it set up. So we have here, if we look at the query on the movie, there is a field release date. That's obviously not a WordPress core thing, right? So that's something I added for this purpose. So to do that, just like you can with the REST API to add fields to the REST API, you can add fields to GraphQL. So very, very easy. I think. Oh, come on, aren't you? Let's see. Let me go back into edit mode so I can zoom in on that. Yeah. But apparently that's the most I can do. Hopefully that's okay. Okay, so all I'm doing here, very normal WordPress stuff. I add a filter. I'm filtering the GraphQL post fields, so that's going to be the fields on the post type. And then I add a function as the callback, and then this filter passes the fields as an array. So I take those fields, I add a release date field, and in GraphQL, each field has three things. They have a type, which is the type of data. That's the contract you're making with the server and the client. What type of data should the client expect to be returned? In my case, I'm defining it as a string. There's built-in types with WPGraphQL, so in my case, I'm just referencing the built-in types. So I say, hey, the type is going to be a string. I add a description that's going to be used, one, for inline documentation. If I'm reading the code, now as a developer, I know what this field is intended to do. But as a consumer, looking in here, right, I can also look on post, right, there's going to be a release date in here, and I can read the description here. The date the film was released, that's the same description I wrote in my code, right? So now it's documented in my code base, but it's also documented in my consumer, interactions, right? And then the last thing is a resolve function. So the resolver gets passed as GraphQL resolves data from your query request. It passes the object it just resolved to the next thing. So in our case, when we say I want a list of movies, it resolves this movie, passes by normal WordPress methods, get post, passes that post object to these fields to do something with. So in this case, since we're filtering the post fields, the object that is being resolved that gets passed to it is a post object. Now I can do something with that to resolve my data. So I take that post, I get post meta. In our case, I have post meta release date. I get that data. Here I'm just validating to make sure it's an actual timestamp. If it is, then I return it. If it's not a timestamp, I return null. So in our case, if we ask for release date, if it's a valid timestamp, which I believe all of mine are, because I created the data set, we should get a release date. So yeah, you'll see release date get returned here. It's very powerful stuff. So super easy. How many lines of code? That's the same amount of lines of code it would take about to add something to the REST API. So very easy. One thing that's actually cool. So Human Made. If anybody familiar with Human Made, their WordPress agency. They actually, one of their developers built an extension for WPGraphQL already that allows, if you're using register meta or whatever, they built an extension that takes your existing code that's using that and ports it over to GraphQL. It'll only work for a couple types like strings, integers, booleans, whatever types the REST API supports. GraphQL is a lot more complex, but if you go, so it doesn't support everything that GraphQL does in the same way, but it can get you a head start on some of that. So it's GitHub, Rob O'Rourke, WP GraphQL Meta is the extension. There's a chance that it might actually make it to the core plugin, so that might be a core feature of the WP GraphQL plugin. But that allows you to actually register fields in one spot for both REST and GraphQL. So depending on your situation, you might already have applications that use REST, but may want to transition some features to GraphQL. That allows you to manage some of the data in one spot. Actually, if you go to the WP GraphQL repo, that's actually linked in the README file as well, so you can find it there too. So that's pretty interesting. So that's what it looks like to add a field. So you can also register types. It's actually a closed pull request. Is anybody familiar with Daniel Bachhuber, maintainer of WP CLI? He has a plugin called Bylines, which allows you to add multiple authors. It's kind of a new version of Co-Authors Plus, if you're familiar with that. He's working on modernizing that under the bylines.io. So there's actually as a teaser of what it might look like to add GraphQL support to another plugin, there's actually a pull request in here that shows what defining a new type, byline in my case, would look like. So if you wanted to, you could look at that. It registers a new byline type to the GraphQL API, it registers what fields there are, and then like my demo or my examples early on, you can query posts and their bylines. So he didn't merge it in, but the pull request is there. So maybe one day. But it's also a good example if you have your own plugins or code base and you want to extend it. It's a great example to look at. So last step. So now we've added the release date, which we've already made use of in our query. It's already rendering. So last step is pagination. So let's open this last one. So the only file we're going to work with on here is the movies page on the components movies page. So we have, if we look at that page again, we have a list of movies, but no load more button. So in this step, we'll add a load more button. We'll connect an action to that so that Apollo knows to go refetch data. We'll then make use of the cursor I mentioned earlier. So it'll take the cursor from our previous query, use that in our next query, and we'll take the results of that new query and append it to our list of data. So it's actually, it sounds complex, but it's actually not too crazy. So step one, uncomment this. So we'll uncomment that. That's going to add us a load more button. It's not doing anything yet. So let's copy this and add it. We're going to add a new row to our markup here. Ooh. Ooh. Close this. That pasted ugly. What's that? Yeah. Alright, so this is going to give us a load more button, and it's telling us there's an error with our have previous page because we haven't connected it with that query. So now we're going to replace our query with one that supports pagination. So we can comment this query, delete our old one. Cool. So now we have a query that's getting data. The reason that was failing because we were looking up here, our load more, the function that renders our load more button checks if the query has previous page. So if we're at a point in our data set where there's no more data, that's going to be false. I don't want to render the load more button anymore. Okay. So that's why that error just showed up. So now we can replace our GraphQL connected component. And delete this line. Alright. And I'll explain what this is doing in a second. So now we should have a load more button at the bottom. I can click load more, and I have more data. So let's take a look at what I changed here. So we had our movies, we were using GraphQL function to connect our movies query with our component, our movies page component. So what I did change in here, this probably the most complex part. I do in the written tutorial explain this, also in the GitHub commits for further explanation. But what we're doing, we're taking, Apollo is connecting some data for us already to the component. We're taking that and we're adjusting it. So we take, Apollo gives us all this data, loading movies, a fetch more, which is a function to fetch more. So we take that, we take that existing loading, the existing movies, the existing fetch more, and we add a new thing to return to our component. In this case, it's a function. So it's going to be a function load more entries. What does that do? When that runs, it fetches more data. It uses an Apollo method called fetch more. So fetch more is going to use our movie query, the same movies query we wrote up here. This movies query has variables, so this is going to use cursor variable. What value is that going to be? It's going to be our existing page info start cursor, which we got on the initial query. Apollo stored that in Redux, so we now have that start cursor that we can use in our next query. So we use that query, or we use that variable. It's either going to be a null value or a cursor. If it's null value, GraphQL is just going to get the first or the last 20 items. If it is a value, it's going to get the last 20 items before that point in the data set. So now Apollo has an action that runs called update query. So whenever the query results come back, we're telling Apollo what to do with that data. So here, a lot of this is just comments. Let me actually make this full view here. So when Apollo receives the data back from the GraphQL query, it says, hey, I got this new data, what should I do with it? In our case right now, we're going to take the result of the fetch more. So when you click the button, it runs, it fetches more data with our cursor, gets back movies, right? Because that's the shape of our GraphQL query. So we get those, and we store it as a variable called new edges. Then it checks the result of the query for page info. We're going to store that as a variable page info. And then we're gonna modify what gets returned to our Redux store. So in our case, we're going to return movie edges. We're going to take the results of our previous queries. So if Redux already has 20 movies in the Redux store, we're going to take that, and this is ES6, it's called an array spread operator, and we're going to take the new movies from our new query and append it or merge it. Like this is equivalent to a PHP array merge. So we're going to take our new movies, append it to our old movies array, and then we're going to replace the page info that we used to have, which stored our cursor from our previous query. We're going to replace that with our new page info so that we have the new cursor we can reference on our next query. So it's a lot of code. A lot of this is comments explaining what's happening, though, so it's not that much code. And it is well documented. Apollo, there's lots of great resources. LearnApollo.com. Dev.apollodata.com is their official dev site, so tons of documentation on using that. But the results are now paginated list of movies. And if we look at what's happening, let's open up React DevTools again. Also, for those Vue users out here, Apollo plays great with Vue too. So it's not just a React thing. So you can use GraphQL and Apollo to manage your state, use Redux to manage your state, and use Vue to render your components. So you React, Vue, you can use Angular, you can use vanilla JavaScript, whatever you want. So yeah, let's take a look at our React DevTools now and see what happens when we click the load more. So if we look at, oops, I do the wrong one. So yeah, so we can see, yep. So this is our movies component, right? Let me zoom in again, sorry. So our movies list component, we can see the movies page info. We have a cursor here that we're referencing. When I click load more, that cursor should change. Oh, of course. It's a bummer that it refreshed. But anyway, this cursor now changed. So we have a different cursor, and now you can see we have 60 items of movies. If I click it again, load more, of course this is going to, okay, they're going to refresh. But now we have 80 movies, right? And my component just re-rendered because this part of the component is connected to just that part of the Redux state tree, right? So now we got 80 movies. I can click it again. I'm just going to keep clicking it because at some point, I think I have like 200 movies or something loaded up in here. I don't remember, but what's that? I know, it's crazy. Yay, now we're out, right? So we got, what is it, 183 movies. But page info now returned to us has previous page false. Because GraphQL knows there's no more data that you're trying to query because it knew where in the data set you're starting and it knew there was nothing after it. So it returned false. Now we don't render that button anymore, so no more pagination. So that gets us to the full app that lives at learn.wpgraphql.com as a WordPress theme. So there's, like I mentioned, some resources. WPGraphQL.com is a website for the plugin. There's a Learn button in the menu that'll take you to the written tutorial of this series. It's actually 12 steps instead of the 6 we did here. I actually show how to connect it to WordPress, like on cue the React app in a WordPress theme environment as well. And I get into more detail on a lot of stuff. So if you want to do this at home again, the resources are on the website there. How much time do I have left? All right, I'll just touch a few things and then we'll do questions. So I mentioned early on, GraphQL makes it easier to version. I mentioned Facebook has been using GraphQL in-house since 2012. No breaking changes in that entire time, not a single one, which is insane. If you've ever tried to version a REST API, it can get tricky. We've actually broken applications in-house because we didn't realize how many different people were using the endpoint. So we changed the field from, we had one field that returned a string at one point. We changed it to return an object with richer data. We didn't realize somebody else on another team was using that endpoint, and it broke their app. It solved the problem for our team, but it broke their team's app. So that can get interesting on REST. With GraphQL, what you would do, here's an example visually. Let's say you have a film, and you have the type opening crawl. Okay, that one doesn't matter. Okay, you add director as a string, but you decide later on director actually should return an object. So here what they do, they leave director as a string. They mark it as deprecated, which will actually not show in public queries. So if you actually open up documentation tools, unless you explicitly ask for deprecated fields, it's not even going to be visible in your schema. So existing clients can still reference the director field and get a string. They can introduce a new field directed by that returns a more complex object type, which would be a person that has different fields on it, like name, whatever. named, directed, acted in. So all this rich data. So old client applications that used to just reference the string still work. New client applications can reference this new directed by field. They both work, no breaking changes, everybody's happy. Then you can actually monitor, since GraphQL queries are static strings, you can monitor over time what fields different applications are referencing, and then completely deprecate the field once you know no consumer is actually consuming that field. With REST, you don't know what fields a consumer is using, you just know the endpoint. So if you have an endpoint that has 100 fields and you want to deprecate 20 of them, you don't know what consumers are or are not using it. With GraphQL, you know every field they're using because they specify up front, here's the fields I asked for. So again, GraphQL offers amazing tooling like Graphical, the tool I've been demoing on. Also has great built-in IDE tools. I believe I use PHP Storm even for my JavaScript development, but works great. GraphQL type ahead, just like I do in Graphical. You can set up a GraphQL config.json file or something like that, point it at an endpoint, and you get your schema. Your IDE knows about it. I believe Atom has tools for it, and I'm sure other code editors do as well. So now I've preached about GraphQL. Should you use it? So here's a chart. Maybe. I don't know. So here's the level of effort, the app size, and complexity. So when you're first getting started, the REST API is probably a lot easier to learn, right? It's already built into core, so there's nothing you got to do to activate it if you're using WordPress. Easy to learn. It can't get much easier than just say fetch this endpoint, right? That's pretty easy to get started with. As your app grows in complexity, the more you use REST, the quicker you get to this line of being fed up and getting frustrated. I can tell you from experience. When you start introducing tools like React or Vue and Redux to manage state and manage what you're doing with that data, it gets a little bit easier to manage, right? Instead of if you started with just jQuery and the REST endpoints, you'll get fed up pretty quick. You start introducing frameworks like Vue and Redux and React, it starts becoming a lot easier to manage, but you still get to a point pretty quick where you're getting fed up. Like, these REST endpoints are hard to debug. Like 6 months from now, try to visit something you built with the REST endpoint, and you're going to spend a whole day just reading documentation again because you don't know what data's coming back, what's happening. Adding something like GraphQL into the mix, it's a little bit harder to learn up front, right? There's this whole new query language, so it's a little bit harder effort to get started, but long term, you and your team are going to take longer to get fed up with your application and code base because it's a lot easier. 6 months from now, looking at this, it might be confusing now because you might not be an expert at the GraphQL query language, but I can tell you this is a lot easier to read 6 months from now than a REST endpoint. I can see we're getting posts, we're getting movies, we're getting release date. I, as a developer, can read that pretty easily. So 6 months from now, I'm going to be less fed up trying to maintain this code than something like a REST endpoint or like an XML RPC endpoint or something like that. So here's some great links to GraphQL tools. WPGraphQL is available for WordPress today. It is, for what it's worth, so I work for a WordPress VIP client. We host with WordPress VIP, which is automatic. They code review everything we put out. This is VIP approved, the plugin. It's not on the SVN repo. It might be it someday, but it is VIP approved. So if you do work with VIP clients, 10up is building, or not 10up, sorry. They might be using it too, but Human Made is actually building a boilerplate project that will have this built into it, and like an intro theme or like an intro theme using it. They're building extensions for it actively right now too. So there might be breaking changes. It's not a 1.0 release yet. Feel free to use it. It's secured, scalable, but there might be like naming changes that we make, like post tags right now. Probably is going to get changed to tags. So there could be some minor breaking changes like that before it hits a 1.0 release, but you can definitely take it, download it, use it right now. And then one other thing, since I have a few minutes left, I didn't even talk about it, mutations. GraphQL can write data too, it's not just for reading. Right now, at the very moment, we only support a couple mutations, but a lot more will be coming soon. So for example, create post. Same thing, you can, GraphQL validates the input that you're sending. So let's say we want to create a post with the title, I don't know, WCOC 2017, right? And each GraphQL query requires a client mutation ID for busting the Redux cache or whatever cache you use. Relay is another GraphQL client you can use, and this should work with it. I've never tested it. So then GraphQL, when you mutate data, you can actually ask for data back. So it serves as a mutation and a query at the same time. So I can create a post with a title, but I can ask back on that post that just got created, the title, you know, like the date, the title, maybe the link, the ID, rich data like this. I should get an error because I'm not authenticated though. Sorry, you're not allowed to create posts. So I would have to activate. If you were in WordPress, you could use cookie authentication the same way you would for the REST API. In my case, I'm going to use Basic Auth, which is also a plugin that was built for the REST API. So it plays nice with that. So plugins will activate Basic Auth. I'll create real quick a user. We'll call it like WCOC 2017. Just for brevity, WCOC 17 will be the password real quick. So any of you doing this could go mutate data on this demo site if you wanted to. Go email. What's that? Yeah, I will. Cool, so now I have a user. So what we need to do to use that, we need a base64 encoded username and password. So just go to base64decode.com. We'll username, password, we'll encode that, get that. So this is if you're using the REST API and want to do authentication with that, if you have the Basic Auth plugin enabled, you can send headers. This tool allows us to edit headers. We say authorization. I think this is correct. Oh, come on. Yeah. Oh no, am I done? Alright, save that. Oh, and I cleared my query. So, oh gosh. Mutation, create post. Wow. So, if that works. Ah, no, did I do that wrong? Authorization basic. Oh, did I? Oh, dang it. Did I forget to set that? Oh, did I not? Did not create? Shoot. What did I do? WCOC 2017. Password. Let's try that again. Admin. Use weak password. Oh, it's forcing strong. Alright, I'll just copy that. Alright, now let's decode that. Sorry about that. Alright, now we have a user. Can edit the headers. -1 minute. Oh. Now. Oh, of course not. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but there are mutations, and they work with, like in our case, we use OAuth, so we use the REST API OAuth plugin. So if you use that, you can use the same authentication you use there. The actual demo, the written demo uses, actually the written demo doesn't have authentication in there. There's no mutations. But there is one last plugin. So under plugins, this is also on GitHub. under the WPGraphQL repo, WPGraphQL, which brings this graphical tool straight to the WordPress admin. So now you can activate this, browse your GraphQL endpoint straight from the admin of whatever site you're activated on. And this will use cookie authentication, so I should have just done the demo in here because this already works. And then I'm getting kicked out. So last second. All right. So implementation ID. All right. So this is going to use my authenticated user already. Boom. There we go. We got an ID. If we go to posts, we're going to see WCOC 2017 created in my post. Boom. There we go. So you can mutate with GraphQL. Query against the mutation you just made. You can even do crazy crazy queries on that mutation. This is actually pretty cool. It has a history in here too. So I can actually do like related stuff if I wanted to. Like I could query for categories on the thing that I just created. Right. So cool. Go download it, play with it, build extensions, start the repo on GitHub. All open source though. Enjoy. Any questions? I know you have a question. You. I don't know. So if you're in WordPress itself, there other than like the declarative nature of writing the query to get related content in one spot, I don't know if there would be a huge win. I think the biggest win is decoupled applications. Yeah, I mean, we probably will be using it in-house, like in our PHP environments. I think mostly for the tooling around it, like we can validate the entire sets of queries in one shot. Like when we merge data in a pull request, we can have tools go validate the query, make sure there's no typos and things like that. So that would be a potential win, but not for the average user, I don't think, because that would take a lot to set up like the continuous integration to check that. So for the average WordPress theme user, probably nothing yet, especially since it's not in core, like because then you're relying on a plugin. I haven't done any super scientific tests, but so far, I mean, like I showed early on, the payload for getting twice as much data was 10 times less than the REST API. So, I mean, just observation. I know Edwin Cromley, he was involved in the REST API. He's actually involved in this too. He's written a lot of tests, and he's done some tests, I think more scientific tests, and it's outperforming the rest quite a bit. We'll do some real testing. I'll use Pantheon's load test for that he talked about earlier today and hit this up and get some stats for you guys.
All right.
Cool.
I do want to let you guys know that there is a giant TV that is being wrapped